For more than a century, some of the most important witnesses in human history were lying in silence. A man froze, high in the Alps with an arrow wound in his shoulder. A teenage girl vanished into a flooded cave in what is now Mexico. A skeleton in Britain seemed to belong to the first known people of the island. Another found beside the Columbia River triggered one of the fiercest archaeological disputes in modern America. And in Siberia, an entire human group was discovered from fragments so small they should have meant almost nothing. At first, each of these bodies seemed to tell a familiar story. A prehistoric European, an early American, a lost hunter, a strange outlier, a dead end. But that was before ancient DNA began speaking. What it revealed was not a clearer version of the old history. It was a different history altogether. Faces changed. Origins shifted. Migrations reversed direction. Entire populations that once looked separate turned out to be family. Others, confidently placed inside the human story, suddenly no longer fit where anyone had put them. The deeper scientists looked, the less stable the old map became. Because bones can mislead, skulls can distort, appearances can survive for thousands of years and still tell the wrong story. But DNA does something more unsettling. It cuts beneath the shape of a face, beneath the assumptions of historians, beneath the stories nations tell about where they came from. And once it did, 5 ancient skeletons began to undo some of the most persistent ideas ever written about our past. Not by a little. Completely. Before DNA entered the picture, history was often reconstructed from what the dead looked like. That was the method. Measure the skull, compare the jaw, study the brow ridge, the cheekbones, the angle of the face. Build a migration story from bone shape alone. For a long time, that seemed reasonable. It was scientific. It was careful. And sometimes it was completely wrong. In Europe, the story looked straightforward. Early farmers had moved in from the Near East. Later migrations from the steppe reshaped the continent. Ancient remains were placed somewhere inside that sequence, often with more confidence than the evidence deserved. If a skeleton looked familiar, it was folded into the known pattern. If it looked unusual, it was treated as an exception. In the Americas, the uncertainty ran deeper. Some of the oldest skeletons did not resemble modern indigenous populations in the way researchers expected. Their skulls seemed narrower, longer, or more archaic. That difference led to a powerful idea. Maybe the first people in the Americas were not the direct ancestors of Native Americans at all. Maybe there had been an earlier population. Maybe more than one. That possibility opened the door to decades of speculation. Separate migrations, lost waves, even theories that pushed the origins of some ancient American remains toward Europe or Polynesia, despite thin evidence. And then there were the fragments that barely seemed worth classifying. A finger bone here, a tooth there. Scraps from deep time, too incomplete to transform anything. So the old historical map held not because it was secure, but because there was nothing stronger to replace it. Then, the molecules inside the bones began to survive scrutiny. And one by one, the dead started correcting the living. The details only made the mystery worse. Ötzi was not just an ancient body. He was a man preserved in ice, high in the Alps carrying a copper axe, a bow, unfinished arrows, and the signs of a violent death. An arrowhead was lodged in his shoulder. His last hours could be reconstructed almost frame by frame. And yet the closer he seemed to us, the less certain his place in European prehistory became. Naia raised a different problem. She was found deep inside Hoyo Negro, a submerged chamber, in the Yucatán, one of the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever recovered from the Americas. She appears to have fallen into the cave when it was still dry. Her skull looked like other so-called Paleo-American remains, broad-faced and visibly different from many later indigenous groups. That difference kept feeding an older suspicion. Maybe the first Americans did not look like modern Native Americans because they were not the same population at all. In Britain, Cheddar Man seemed to belong to a simpler story. He had lived around 10,000 years ago, not long after the end of the last ice age, and his remains were among the oldest, near-complete human skeletons in the country. But even here, the familiar image of early northern Europeans rested more on assumption than proof. The bones were ancient. The face was imagined. The past was being filled in by habit. Then came Kennewick Man, later called the Ancient One. Found in Washington state in 1996, he became the center of a bitter legal and scientific battle. His skull did not fit expectations, and that was enough to send the case spiraling into arguments about ancestry ownership and whether one skeleton could redraw the peopling of an entire continent. And in Siberia, the strangest clue of all waited inside Denisova cave, a finger bone and a few teeth so fragmentary they should have been a footnote. Instead, they hinted that the human past was not merely misunderstood. It was far more crowded than anyone had imagined. The turning point came when ancient bones stopped being treated mainly as shapes and started being treated as archives. That required a technological leap. Ancient DNA is damaged, fragmented, and easily overwhelmed by modern contamination. But improved cleanroom methods, high-throughput sequencing, and a crucial realization about where DNA survives best, especially in the dense petrous part of the temporal bone, changed the field. Suddenly, remains once considered too degraded could produce genomes, ancestry profiles, even clues to appearance and adaptation. Once that happened, the old arguments began collapsing with surprising speed. Naia's mitochondrial DNA placed her in haplogroup D1, a lineage common in indigenous peoples of the Americas today, strongly linking early Paleo-American remains to later Native American populations, despite their different skull shape. Kennewick Man's genome pushed even harder in the same direction. Whatever his skull seemed to suggest, his closest affinities were with Native Americans, including groups from the Columbia Plateau. In Europe, the revisions were just as sharp. A new, high-coverage genome for Ötzi showed that earlier readings had been distorted by contamination. Instead of carrying the kind of steppe ancestry many expected, he had an unusually high proportion of Anatolian farmer ancestry, along with genetic indicators for darker skin, dark eyes, and balding. Cheddar Man delivered a different shock. Mesolithic Britain did not look the way popular imagination had painted it. His DNA pointed toward dark skin pigmentation and blue eyes, a combination that forced a rethinking of when lighter skin became widespread in Europe. And then there was Denisova Cave, where DNA did something almost unprecedented. It identified a human group before archaeology had truly recognized it. From a finger bone and a few teeth emerged the Denisovans, a distinct archaic population that later passed genetic material into living people across Asia and Oceania. At that moment, ancient DNA stopped refining history. It started discovering actors history did not know it had lost. What these findings changed was bigger than the identity of 5 ancient dead. Naia and the Ancient One struck at one of the oldest uncertainties in the history of the Americas. For years, unusual skull shapes had encouraged the idea that the earliest people in the New World might have belonged to a separate founding population, perhaps only distantly related to later Native Americans. The genetic evidence forced that picture to narrow. Whatever the differences in appearance, these ancient individuals were not strangers to the continent's living indigenous peoples. They were part of the same deeper story, one tied to migration through Beringia, and to change over time after arrival, not to some lost non-native people displaced without a trace. In Europe, the reversal was quieter, but just as profound. Cheddar Man showed that the image many people instinctively attached to ancient Britons was built on projection, not evidence. Ötzi showed something even more destabilizing, that a man found in the heart of Alpine Europe could still carry ancestry far more heavily shaped by early Anatolian farmers than expected, reminding us that migration waves did not wash over every region in the same way or at the same speed. Isolation mattered. Continuity mattered. Local history could resist the continental script. And Denisovans shattered the deepest assumption of all, that by the time modern humans spread across Eurasia, the cast of human history was already known. It was not. An entire archaic population had remained invisible until genetics exposed it, and its legacy still survives in living people, from Denisovan ancestry in parts of Asia and Oceania to adaptive variants linked to life at high altitude in Tibet. That is the larger implication of ancient DNA. It does not merely fill gaps. It reveals that some of the gaps were created by the stories we told too soon. What these 5 cases finally destroyed was the illusion that the past can be read safely from the surface. A frozen man in the Alps is no longer just a symbol of prehistoric Europe. He is a genetic outlier with unusually high Anatolian farmer ancestry. A girl at the bottom of a drowned cave in Yucatán and a skeleton beside the Columbia River are no longer evidence for some vanished non-native population. Their DNA ties them back into the ancestry of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And a finger bone from Siberia did something almost impossible. It revealed an entire human group before archaeology had fully recognized that group existed at all. That is the real consequence of the ancient DNA revolution. It has shown that appearance and ancestry do not always move together. That migration was not a single wave, but repeated movement, isolation, mixture, and survival. That some populations changed so much in form that they seemed unrelated, while others carried ancient lineages into the present with far more continuity than expected. Even extinction became less final once living people were found to carry Denisovan ancestry, including genetic variants linked to high-altitude adaptation in Tibet. So the deeper lesson is not simply that science corrected a few old mistakes. It is that human history was never the clean story we wanted. It was always crowded, always entangled, always more intimate than it looked. And somewhere in one more cave, one more grave, one more fragment of bone, the next correction is still waiting.